It was just another late night shift at the gas station, one of those quiet shifts that drag on forever. I worked at a small 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town, a place where people stopped only if they were desperate for gas or a bathroom. The building itself was a little rundown, with flickering lights and old creaky doors. Nothing ever really happened here. It was the kind of place where you could hear the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls, and the hum of the neon sign outside was your only company for hours. I had been working for a few months when this all started. At first, I didn't think much of it. The late hours can play tricks on your mind, and I guess that's what I chalked it up to. But the more it happened, the more I realized I wasn't imagining things. It was just past midnight when it first happened. I was behind the counter, reading through some old magazines, when I heard the distinctive sound of a car pulling up to the pump. I glanced up and saw a rusty old truck pull in, its engine sputtering as it came to a stop. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I noticed the man driving it was alone. He wasn't the kind of person you'd stop at a gas station at this hour. He was dressed in a torn, dirty jacket and had unkempt hair. He didn't look particularly threatening, but there was something unsettling about him. His eyes, something about the way he looked at me, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I watched as he got out of the truck and started pumping gas. As he did, I noticed something strange. The gas pump clicked off, signaling that his tank was full, but he didn't stop. Instead, he kept pumping, the fuel spilling over the side of the truck and pooling on the ground beneath him. I stood up, thinking maybe I should go out and say something. But before I could move, the man turned and looked at me. His expression was blank, but those eyes were so cold, so empty. It was like he wasn't really there, not in a physical sense, but in some other way, something deep and unsettling. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go out there, but I also didn't want to just let him waste gas. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but then thought better of it. Maybe I was overreacting. It was just a weird guy, nothing more. Before I could make a decision, the man finished pumping and walked back to his truck, completely ignoring the spill on the ground. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced at me again, his eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't look away. It was like he was waiting for something, but I couldn't figure out what. The moment passed, and the man drove off into the night, his truck disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, staring at the empty gas pump for gas, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. The next night, the same thing happened. Another car pulled in, another strange, unsettling person. This time, it was a woman dressed in a long, tattered coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. She pulled up to the pump, got out, and started filling her car. This time, I didn't wait to see if anything strange would happen. I stood up, walked outside, and asked if she needed help. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge me. She just kept pumping gas, her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if she didn't see me at all. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood there, watching her. There was something about her movements that seemed off, like she was on autopilot. I could feel my heart racing, and a cold sweat started to form on my forehead. "Ma'am?" I called out again, trying to get her attention. But she didn't budge. She just continued pumping gas as if I wasn't even there. I started to walk toward her, but before I could get any closer, she abruptly stopped. She turned to me, and for the first time, I saw her face clearly. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. She had a look of pure terror on her face, like she had just seen something she couldn't explain. Without a word, she climbed back into her car, slammed the door, and sped off, tires screeching as she disappeared into the night. I stood there, frozen, wondering what the hell had just happened. This continued for the next few nights. Strange people, always at the same time, after midnight, coming to the station, filling their tanks, and acting as if they were completely unaware of me. They wouldn't respond when I tried to talk to them, and they'd always leave quickly, without a word. It was as if they were all in some kind of trance, doing the same thing over and over, night after night. One night, I decided to stay in the parking lot instead of behind the counter. Maybe I'd catch one of these people in the act and figure out what was going on. I waited and waited, staring at the road, my eyes heavy from lack of sleep. Just as the clock struck 1 a.m., I saw the headlights of a car appear on the horizon. It was a black sedan, sleek and shiny, unlike any car I had seen around here. It pulled into the station, the engine purring smoothly as it glided to a stop at one of the pumps. I didn't move. I just watched, my heart pounding in my chest. The driver's side door opened, but no one stepped out. I stared at the car for a while, but there was no sign of anyone getting out. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hand appeared on the window, slowly tapping against the glass. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know who was inside the car or what was going on, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I quickly made my way back to the door, but before I could even reach the handle, I heard a voice behind me. A soft, almost whispering voice that sent shivers down my spine. You shouldn't have seen that. I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. The car was still parked at the pump, but it was empty. No one had gotten out. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I forced myself to turn around and head back inside. I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking as I did. The night dragged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and stressed, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something sinister going on, and I was caught in the middle of it. I never saw the man or woman from before again, but every night I stayed awake, waiting for the next car to pull in, the next stranger to step out, the next voice that would whisper from the shadows. It's been years since that night, but I still work at that same gas station. The people who come in are just as strange, just as cold. Some of them don't even look human, and sometimes when I'm standing behind the counter, I'll hear that whispering voice again. Soft, chilling, and always the same. You shouldn't have seen that.
Next story.
It was a late October night, and I was driving back home from a business trip. The clock on my dashboard blinked 2:15 a.m., and the streets were empty. The only thing keeping me awake was the hum of the tires on the highway. My gas tank was running on empty, and I knew the next station wasn't for another 20 miles. But just ahead, I saw the flicker of lights. A gas station, tucked away from the highway like it was waiting for me. I pulled in, relieved to finally get some fuel. The station was a little rundown, with flickering neon lights spelling out "open 24 hours" in bold letters. It was one of those places that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Old pumps, faded signs, and a small, dimly lit convenience store attached. I didn't think much of it. I just needed to fill up and get back on the road. The station was empty except for an older man behind the counter. He didn't look up as I walked inside. He had a thin, pale face and an almost ghostly aura about him. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were stuck in a loop of some kind. I could feel a strange chill in the air, even though the temperature was still warm outside. "Fill it up?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice, not even looking at me. "Yeah, regular, please," I said, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. I walked back outside to the pump, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the stillness. As I filled my tank, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind had picked up, swirling around me, and I heard the distant sound of something scraping against metal, like nails on a chalkboard, but far off in the distance. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild in the silence of the night. I finished pumping the gas and went back inside to pay. The old man was still behind the counter, his eyes fixed on the wall, staring into nothingness. "You okay, man?" I asked, trying to make small talk. "It's pretty late, huh?" He didn't respond. His lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. It was more like he was holding something back, something sinister. He finally looked at me, and when he did, I saw something in his eyes. Something. Hollow. Like he wasn't all there. $2, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I paid, still feeling uneasy. As I stepped back toward the door, I glanced back one last time. There was something odd about the shelves in the convenience store. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly left, walking back to my car. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The car sputtered at first, but it eventually roared to life. I pulled away from the gas station, the bright neon lights in my rearview mirror slowly fading away as I sped down the road. But as I drove, I began to feel like something wasn't right. The air felt colder, even though I had the heat on in the car. My headlights illuminated the dark road ahead, but it was like the night itself was swallowing everything up, making the road ahead seem endless. I glanced at my rearview mirror again, expecting to see the station's lights fading into the distance, but they weren't there. I squinted. There was no sign of the gas station. It was like it had disappeared entirely. That's when I started to panic. I kept looking behind me, but the road was empty. No other cars, no streetlights, just an endless stretch of dark asphalt. I hit the brakes, slowing down, hoping to spot any sign of the gas station, but there was nothing. I turned on the high beams, scanning the sides of the road, but all I could see were trees and thick shadows. I shook my head, thinking I was losing it. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized, but my eyes must have played tricks on me. I gripped the steering wheel harder, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. Minutes passed, and I still couldn't shake the strange sense of dread that had settled in my chest. Then I saw something ahead. A flicker of light, far off in the distance. I let out a sigh of relief. It had to be another gas station, or maybe an exit. But as I drove closer, I realized it was the same gas station. It didn't make sense. I had driven miles away from it, but somehow, there it was again, sitting in the same spot like I had never left. The neon lights were still flickering, the same broken sign that read, "Open 24 hours," glowing faintly in the distance. But something was different now. The station looked even more rundown, older, like time itself had passed it by. My heart raced as I slowly pulled into the station once more, my headlights illuminating the dark, empty lot. This time, there was no one in sight. No cars, no people. Nothing. Just the wind rustling through the air. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I leave? Should I go inside again? I glanced at the gas meter. My tank was full, but something was pulling me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. Either way, I got out of the car and walked toward the convenience store. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. The same man was behind the counter, his eyes locked on the wall, his face pale and unmoving. "You again?" I said, my voice shaky. "What's going on here? What is this place?" He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I took a step forward. "What's going on?" I repeated, my voice rising. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. The lights flickered, and I felt a pressure in the air, like the very room was suffocating me. The old man turned his head slowly, and for the first time, his mouth opened. "Don't ask questions," he whispered, his voice deep and hollow. "You don't belong here." I froze. My body went cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching and twisting like they were alive. The air grew heavier, and I felt the walls closing in on me. "Leave now," the man said, his voice a low, guttural growl. I turned, but before I could reach the door, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My heart hammered in my chest, and I bolted for the door, slamming my hand against the handle. The door wouldn't open. I yanked at it, panic setting in, but it was as though the door itself was alive, holding me in place. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, like a breath right next to my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but there was no one there. The old man was gone, his place behind the counter empty. The room was silent now, except for the whispering, which seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I don't know how I managed to break free, but the next thing I remember, I was outside, gasping for air, running toward my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I started the car, slammed it into drive, and sped off. I didn't look back. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still there, that the gas station was still behind me, following me, waiting for me to return. I've tried to forget about that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion or stress, but deep down, I know what I saw. That gas station isn't just a place. It's something else, a place where time doesn't exist, a place that traps people like me, people who make the mistake of stopping, and I'll never be able to forget the whispering.
Next story.
It was around 1:30 a.m. when I pulled into the gas station, tired after a long shift at work. The night had been slow and the road was deserted. The only thing keeping me going was the hum of the tires on the highway, the quiet swish of the air conditioning, and the thought of a hot meal waiting at home. But my gas gauge was blinking on empty, so I knew I had to stop. The gas station I pulled into was in the middle of nowhere. I'd passed it a dozen times before, but had never actually stopped here. It was a small, dilapidated place with faded red and yellow lights that barely lit up the pumps. The convenience store attached to the station had a few neon signs, but they were all flickering as if they were struggling to stay on. The whole place had a rundown, forgotten feel about it. A bad vibe. I parked by the pump and stepped out of the car. The wind was sharp, biting into my skin as I walked over to the pump, my shoes scraping against the cracked concrete. I could hear the sound of a dog barking in the distance and the hum of a refrigerator inside the convenience store. The night was strangely still, too still. There was no sound of traffic, no rustling of leaves, just a quiet, unsettling emptiness. I began pumping gas, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The station was completely empty, which seemed odd for a place that had been marked as open 24 hours. I glanced around expecting to see someone at the counter, but the windows of the store were dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I noticed the man. He appeared out of nowhere, standing just inside the store, watching me through the window. He was tall, dressed in a ragged jacket and jeans, his face obscured by the dim light. He didn't move, just stood there and staring. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just a local. Maybe he was waiting for his friend. But something about the way he stood there motionless made my stomach turn. I couldn't stop looking at him, even though I knew I should. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I was stuck. I finished pumping the gas, and my eyes lingered on him for just a moment longer. I swear, in that brief instant, he smiled. A slow, wide grin that made my blood run cold. I quickly grabbed the receipt and hurried back to my car, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. The man didn't move. His eyes never left me as I slid into my seat and locked the door. I turned the engine over, the car sputtering to life, and without a second thought, I sped out of the parking lot, my heart racing. I drove for miles, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The headlights cut through the darkness, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. The whole time I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gas station's lights flickering behind me, but nothing was there. Then, just as I was beginning to calm down, I saw it. A set of headlights, distant at first, but quickly getting closer. Someone was tailing me. I couldn't see the car clearly, but I could feel it gaining on me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just another car on the highway, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The car was getting closer now, its headlights too bright. I hit the accelerator, trying to put some distance between us, but no matter how fast I went, the car stayed right behind me. I could hear the hum of its engine now, a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I tried to shake the thought out of my mind. What if it was the man from the gas station? I made a sharp turn, hoping to lose whoever was behind me, but the car followed, its headlights blinding in my rear view. I didn't dare look back again, focusing all my attention on the road, but I could feel the presence of the car like it was right on top of me. Suddenly, I saw something ahead, a small diner lit up by a flickering neon sign. I decided to pull into the parking lot, hoping the car would drive past. I slammed the brakes, pulling into a spot and killing the engine. The diner was empty except for a waitress behind the counter. I glanced back in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the headlights of the car I had been outrunning, but instead, I saw the familiar gas station sign in the distance. The same flickering lights, the same worn-down pumps. It was impossible. I had driven miles since I left the station. I sat frozen for a moment, not sure what was happening. How could the gas station be back? Was I losing my mind? I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around the parking lot, but there was no car. No one watching me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the same man again. He was standing at the entrance to the diner, staring right at me. I didn't wait for him to move. I bolted out of the car, ran inside the diner, and slammed the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I rushed to the counter and sat down, trying to calm my shaking hands. The waitress looked at me with a raised eyebrow. You okay? She asked, her voice slow and uninterested. I didn't answer her. I just kept glancing back at the door, expecting it to open at any second. But nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to look around. The diner was empty, and the man was gone. I sighed in relief, though my nerves were still shot. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined the whole thing or if something really strange had happened. Either way, I wasn't about to leave the diner anytime soon. Eventually, I left, still shaken, but feeling like I had escaped something I couldn't explain. The drive home was uneventful, the rest of the road stretching out in front of me, quiet and still. The next day, I decided to stop by the gas station again. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers, or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that it was real. When I arrived, it was completely gone. The lot was empty. No gas pumps, no convenience store. Just an overgrown patch of land with nothing to mark it but the fading memory of what had been there. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I was chased, if I was followed, or if I was just losing my mind. But I'll never stop at that gas station again. And if you're ever out on a lonely highway in the middle of nowhere and you see a rundown gas station with flickering lights, I beg you, keep driving.
Next story.
It was late. Too late, really. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching out in front of me like an endless ribbon of black. It wasn't uncommon for me to take long drives after a rough day to clear my head, but tonight something felt off. I was in the middle of nowhere. No towns, no lights, just trees and fields on either side. The radio had long since lost signal, and I was relying on the steady hum of the car to keep me awake. I had passed a few small rundown towns, but none of them seemed to have a gas station open at this hour. I was running low on fuel, and when I saw the faint glow of lights ahead, I thought I had finally found a safe haven. It was a small gas station, tucked between two towering trees, its lights flickering erratically. The sign read Hollister's Rest Stop in weathered, faded letters. It was the kind of place you'd see in old horror movies, the kind of place you hoped you never had to stop at. But I had no choice. My tank was near empty, and I needed to fill up. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. It was quiet, too quiet. No other cars, no people, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The gas station was a relic of the past, its pumps old and rusty. The attendant's booth sat at the far corner, dimly lit by a single bulb. I got out of the car, stretching my legs. The chill of the night air hit me like a slap, and I instinctively pulled my jacket tighter around me. As I approached the pump, I noticed something strange. There was a sign hanging on the front door of the attendant's booth. It read, "Cash only. Please knock if you need assistance." I hesitated for a moment. It seemed odd, but not entirely out of the ordinary for a place like this. I walked up to the booth and knocked lightly on the door. The sound echoed unnervingly in the stillness. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a man appeared. He was tall, with unkempt gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen too much. His clothes were stained and torn in places, and his eyes were the most unsettling part. They were wide and unblinking, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice, his gaze never leaving mine. I quickly explained that I needed to fill up and asked if the pump was still working. He nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I brushed it off as nerves. I was tired, and my only priority was getting back on the road. As I filled up my tank, the man didn't move, just stood by the door of the booth, watching me. It wasn't until I finished that I heard his voice again. "You know, this place has a history," he said, his tone casual but strange. I glanced at him, unsure what he meant. "History?" he nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, not many people know, but this gas station, it's been here a long time, longer than you'd think." I raised an eyebrow. "How long?" The man's smile faded and his eyes grew darker, almost hollow. "A long time. Longer than the land around it. Some say it's been here since the 1920s, but others say it's much older. You'd be surprised what you find when you dig deep enough around here." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something about the way he said it, the way his eyes glinted with something unspoken, that unsettled me. I just wanted to get back to my car and leave. "I don't mean to scare you," he continued, his voice almost a whisper now, But this place has history. People come and go. Sometimes they disappear, but the station, it stays. It's always here. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I quickly paid him, and without another word, I got back in my car. I wasn't going to let him finish whatever story he was about to start. But as I was about to drive away, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. It was a figure standing by the far side of the station. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette, unmoving, like it had been there for years. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, eager to put the gas station behind me. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As I continued driving down the road, I saw the familiar glow of a streetlight ahead, another small town, a sign of civilization. But as I passed, I glanced to the side of the road, and my stomach dropped. The gas station was there. It wasn't on the other side of town. It was right there, just off the highway, in the same spot I had just been. The lights were flickering again, the pumps rusty and old. It looked exactly the same as when I had left, but there was no way I could have missed it on my way out. I had driven past this exact spot less than 5 minutes ago. My heart started pounding, and I swerved the car, pulling over to the shoulder. I stared at the gas station, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, my thoughts crashing together. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. No figures, no dark silhouettes, just the empty highway behind me. I knew I had to go back, but I didn't want to. I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't want to know. But something deep inside me urged me to turn around and investigate. So I did. I drove back to the station, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I arrived, the station looked as it had before. Quiet, abandoned, like it had been waiting for me to return. But this time, I didn't see the old man. The attendant's booth was empty. The door was wide open, but no one was inside. I got out of the car again, my legs weak beneath me. The place was eerily still. It felt like no one had been there for decades, like the building itself was somehow frozen in time. Then, I heard it. A voice, distant and hollow, calling from the shadows of the trees. "Welcome back." I spun around, my blood turning to ice, but there was nothing. I never spoke of that night again. I never found the gas station again. It wasn't on any map, and I couldn't remember the exact location. It was as if the station had never existed at all. But I'll never forget that voice and the way it echoed in the trees.
Next story.
It was just another night shift at the gas station, but tonight felt different. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me, like something was lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to notice it. I had worked here for nearly 6 months, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened before. The gas station was small, located just off the highway, and it was quiet, almost too quiet at night. Most people came in, fueled up, grabbed a drink or a snack, and left. I never expected anything strange. But tonight, things would change. I had just finished stocking the shelves when the first car pulled in. It was an old blue sedan, one of those that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. The engine sputtered as it coasted to a stop at the pump. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just another tired traveler who needed to refuel. A man stepped out of the car. He was tall, wearing a dirty trench coat that seemed out of place for the mild weather. He didn't look like he was in a hurry. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, as he walked to the pump. I glanced up, expecting him to ask for a specific amount of gas or some other typical request, but he didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at the ground as if lost in thought. I watched him for a moment, but something about him didn't sit right with me. There was an odd stillness about him, like he wasn't fully part of this world. His face was pale, too pale, and there was something about his eyes, empty, hollow, that made me feel like I was looking at a ghost. "Can I help you?" I asked cautiously, hoping to break the silence. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned and looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint smile, but it was gone in an instant. The air seemed to grow colder around me, and I suddenly felt a sense of dread. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my instincts were telling me something was wrong. He began pumping gas, but there was no clicking sound, no stop when the tank was full. He just kept pumping and pumping until the gas started spilling over onto the ground, forming a pool at his feet. I stepped forward, ready to tell him to stop, but before I could say anything, he turned and looked at me again, that same cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I froze. The smile wasn't comforting. It was empty, like he wasn't really there. "Sir, you're spilling gas," I said, my voice shaky. "Please, stop." But he didn't stop. He didn't even acknowledge me. His gaze was locked onto mine, and I felt like I was being pulled into his eyes, like he was drawing me into some deep, dark place where nothing good could reach me. I took a step back, my heart racing, when I heard the sound of tires screeching. I turned, but the sedan was already gone. Just like that, it vanished into the night. The gas pump was still running, spilling gas onto the ground, and I could still hear that strange, distant screech in my ears. I didn't know what to think. I couldn't explain it. Had I imagined it? Maybe I'd been too tired. But something about the whole encounter felt too real, too strange to brush off. The man had been so unnatural. As the hours passed, I tried to shake the feeling off, but I couldn't. Something was wrong with that night. I felt like I was being watched, like I was no longer alone in the station. Then, just after 3 a.m., it happened again. This time, the car was a black SUV, sleek and shiny. It stopped at the same pump, and I saw the same man climb out. His coat was different, but he still had that same strange, hollow look in his eyes. He didn't look at me this time, though. He just went straight to the pump and began filling his tank. I was about to approach him again, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he stood there, rigid and unmoving, as if he were waiting for something or someone. I couldn't bring myself to speak. My throat was tight, my hands clammy with sweat. The man finished pumping the gas, but this time he didn't drive off. Instead, he walked to the front of the store, pushing the door open with a soft creak. My heart skipped a beat. The gas station was empty, and I didn't know if he was here for something specific or if he was just lingering. I watched from behind the counter, too afraid to approach him. He stood by the door for a long time, staring out into the night. I couldn't make out any details on his face, just the faint outline of his features. And then, without warning, he turned and looked at me. His eyes were darker now, the hollow emptiness in them deeper than before. He spoke then, his voice a low murmur. "You shouldn't have seen me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen. I couldn't move. Before I could respond, the door opened again and another figure stepped in. This time, it was a woman, her face obscured by a long hooded cloak. She walked past the man without a word, heading straight for the cooler. I watched her, confused and terrified, as she reached for a bottle of water. The woman turned then, her hood falling back to reveal her face. But her face was wrong. Her skin was ashen and her eyes were completely white. There were no pupils, no iris, just empty, milky eyes. I staggered backward, my hands slamming into the counter as I tried to steady myself. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I already knew I didn't want the answer. But the woman said nothing. She simply smiled at me, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. And then, like a mirage, she was gone. The door was open, but there was no sound of footsteps. The woman had vanished. The man in the trench coat remained by the door, his expression unchanged. He didn't speak again. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back of the store, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to leave, to never come back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Fear. Curiosity. I didn't know. All I knew was that I wasn't alone anymore. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept waiting for the man or the woman to come back, but they didn't. The gas station was eerily silent, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the floor beneath my feet. When my shift finally ended, I left the station as quickly as I could. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. How could I? Who would believe me? I still don't know if I imagined the whole thing or if something truly unexplainable happened that night. But every now and then, when I drive past that old gas station, I see something, just a glimpse through the cracked windows or behind the darkened door. And I can't help but wonder if the man in the trench coat is still there, waiting.
Next story.
I still don't know if it was a dream or if it was real, but I can't shake the feeling that it happened. that it was all real, and I wished to God it wasn't. I was driving late at night, the kind of late where it's almost morning, but you don't have the energy to care. My car's headlights cut through the darkness as the empty road stretched ahead, my stomach growling from hunger and my eyes heavy with exhaustion. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and now I was miles away from where I was supposed to be. I hadn't seen another car for hours, and my phone had long since lost signal. That's when I saw it. A gas station, glowing in the distance like a beacon of hope. It was a small, rundown place, nothing fancy. The sign above said Old Creek Gas and Market. It looked like it had been around since the 80s, the kind of place you'd only stop at in an emergency. I pulled in, relieved to finally have a chance to refuel both my car and myself. As I parked, I noticed something odd. There were no other cars, not even a truck. The whole lot was empty, except for a single flickering light above the door. The place seemed deserted, but the lights were on, and I figured the station must have been open 24/7. I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the bell above jingling with the sound of my arrival. The inside was dim, with dusty shelves and a fridge stocked with old snacks. Behind the counter, there was a man, tall, thin, and older, with a scruffy beard. He looked up when I walked in, but didn't say anything. His eyes were tired, almost sunken, but he gave me a polite nod. I glanced around, noticing the place was almost too quiet. There was no music, no sounds of other people, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clicking of a ceiling fan above. It was the kind of place that felt stuck in time. I stepped up to the counter and cleared my throat. "Can I get a pack of gum and some chips?" The man nodded again, still not speaking. He reached for the items, placing them on the counter without a word. I paid, feeling a little uncomfortable under his gaze, but I chalked it up to my exhaustion. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the back wall, near a dusty window, was a strange, old-fashioned photo frame. It looked out of place. Nothing else in the shop seemed like it belonged, but this picture seemed different. It was a black and white photo of the gas station itself, with a group of people standing in front of it. The photo was from a long time ago, but what struck me as odd was the look on the people's faces. They didn't look happy. Their eyes were blank, lifeless. Who are these people? I asked before I could stop myself. The man's expression shifted, his face hardening. He didn't answer immediately, but his gaze turned toward the photo as if it had a grip on him. After a long pause, he spoke. "Those are the ones who never left." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't know what to say. I forced a smile and nodded, thinking maybe he was just trying to creep me out. But the way he said it, his voice so steady, so serious, made me rethink the whole situation. As I stepped back toward the door, I heard him speak again, this time in a quieter tone. "Don't stay too long." I paused, halfway out the door. "What do you mean?" He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me with those tired, sunken eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. I got back in my car, trying to ignore the nagging sense that I was being watched. As I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, I looked into my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I could see his outline through the glass, but there was something strange about it. He didn't move, not a single muscle. He was standing perfectly still, as if he wasn't even alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been on the road too long. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the gas station was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually I came to a small town, the lights of civilization finally breaking through the darkness. I pulled into the first diner I saw, desperate for a break and hoping that maybe I could finally shake off the weirdness from the gas station. I parked and walked inside, and the warmth of the diner hit me like a wave. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, and I could hear the murmur of voices. The place was busy, bustling with the usual late-night crowd. I took a seat at the counter and ordered some coffee. As I waited, I glanced around the room, trying to relax. That's when I noticed something on the wall, a photo, framed and yellowed with age. It was an old picture, a black and white image of a gas station. My stomach dropped. It was the same gas station. The photo looked almost identical to the one I had seen earlier. The same group of people stood in front of the same station with the same blank expressions on their faces. But this time, I noticed something more. There was a woman in the background, a figure I hadn't seen before in the original photo. She was standing just inside the doorway, her eyes locked on the camera. I looked away, my hands shaking as the waitress placed my coffee in front of me. I tried to steady myself, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was connected to that gas station somehow, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the strange things about that night. The man, the photograph, the feeling that the place had somehow followed me. Then the waitress leaned over and whispered in a low voice, "I know you've seen the picture. Be careful. That place is cursed. People who stop there, they never leave. Not really." I stared at her, unable to speak. She nodded as if confirming something I had already known. "It's just the way it works. Once you've been to Old Creek, it gets its claws in you. Don't go back. Don't ever go back." I left the diner without finishing my coffee, my mind reeling with confusion and dread. I don't know what's happening, but I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know what kind of curse is tied to that gas station or why the people there look so lifeless, but one thing is for sure, I won't be going back. Ever.
Next story.
I'll never forget that night. I was just a regular guy, driving home after a late shift, exhausted and barely keeping my eyes open. I don't even remember the exact date. It was some time in the fall, but I know it was one of those nights that sticks with you forever. I had been driving for hours along the empty stretch of highway, the hum of the tires on asphalt barely keeping me awake. The road was desolate, just me and the occasional passing truck, the glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness like a dull knife. It was the kind of night when the sky above you feels too heavy, the air too thick. I was almost out of gas. There were no signs of civilization for miles, just endless trees and the occasional deer darting across the road. I tried to keep my mind focused, but the thoughts of running out of fuel kept circling. That's when I saw the gas station up ahead. It looked old, the kind of place that hadn't seen a renovation in decades. The lights flickered, barely illuminating the cracked pavement leading to the pumps. The sign above the station was barely legible, with half the bulbs out, but I could make out Cedar Ridge Gas in faded red letters. It wasn't much, but it was something, and I had no choice but to stop. I pulled up to one of the pumps, my car making an unsettling squeak as I turned off the engine. The silence that followed was oppressive. There wasn't a single sound except the faint wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak from the old sign above. I stepped out of the car and made my way to the pump, the gravel crunching under my boots. The place felt off from the moment I stepped foot on the property, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't just that it was deserted, though it clearly was. It was the air, the way the darkness seemed to cling to everything. It felt like the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I started pumping gas, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. I glanced around for any sign of life. Maybe the clerk was inside, or at least someone around, but there was nothing. No cars, no lights in the windows, nothing to suggest anyone had been there for a while. As I finished filling up, I heard it. A sound. It came from the door of the gas station, a slow, creaking sound like something or someone was moving inside. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned toward the door, expecting to see the clerk or maybe another traveler. But nothing happened. The door remained closed. I figured I was just being paranoid. Maybe the wind was causing the door to move. I wasn't in the mood to stick around much longer, so I grabbed the receipt and made my way back to the car. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the parking lot, just staring at me. He wasn't close, but he was close enough that I could see him clearly. He was tall, dressed in a heavy jacket and jeans, and his face was obscured by the shadows. But the thing that made my blood run cold wasn't his appearance. It was his stillness. He didn't move, not even a twitch. I froze, unsure what to do. I was caught between the urge to get in my car and drive away as fast as I could and the overwhelming feeling that I needed to figure out what was going on. But the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the man's presence was pulling at me, drawing me in. Before I could make up my mind, the door of the gas station creaked open. Out stepped a woman, a slight figure in a faded blue dress, her hair long and tangled around her face. She moved slowly, her eyes locked on the man, as if they were the only two people in the world. The man didn't react. He just stood there, still as stone. The woman walked toward him, her footsteps slow and deliberate, like she was walking in a dream. She stopped a few feet away from him, and I could see her mouth moving, though I couldn't hear her words from where I was standing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't look away, but I didn't want to get involved. There was something unnatural about the whole scene. The woman's movements were too slow, too fluid, like she wasn't entirely human. Then the man finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and touched her arm. The moment his hand made contact, the woman's head snapped to the side. Her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, met mine for the briefest moment, and I felt a jolt of pure terror. The air around me went still, and then the world went black. I don't know how long I stood there, caught in the darkness. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breathing shallow. My hands were shaking, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the spot where the woman had been. When the darkness finally lifted, I was standing in the parking lot again. The gas station was still there, but it looked different. It was even older, more dilapidated, and there was no sign of the man or the woman. The pumps were gone, replaced by overgrown weeds and cracked concrete. I stumbled back to my car, still shaking, and got in. I didn't even bother to check if I'd locked the door. I started the engine, my hands sweating as I gripped the wheel. I didn't know what had just happened, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out behind me. I never went back to that gas station. I don't even know if it's still there. But I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an ordinary stop. Something happened that night, something I can't explain. And every now and then when I'm driving alone at night, I can still hear that creaking door, the sound of something or someone waiting for me.
Next story.
I was driving home late one night, the road stretching out in front of me like a ribbon of darkness. I'd had a long day at work, and I was exhausted. The highway was practically empty, and the only thing I could hear was the low hum of my tires on the asphalt. My gas gauge was flirting with empty, so I started scanning the road for any sign of a gas station. I was praying I wouldn't run out of fuel before I found one. Finally, I saw it, a small gas station on the side of the road, lit up by dim, flickering lights. It didn't look like much, but I was relieved to see it. The kind of place that made you think it had been there for decades, barely hanging on. I pulled in, parked by the pump, and got out. The air was crisp, and a breeze rustled the trees nearby. It felt like a quiet night, the kind where everything seemed to hold its breath. The station was small, with an old convenience store attached. The windows were dirty, and the neon sign above the door buzzed faintly. Inside, I could see the light from a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. There was no one in sight, which was strange because it was still open, or at least the sign said it was. I approached the pump, and as I slid the nozzle into my tank, I noticed something unusual. There was a figure standing at the door of the convenience store, just inside, watching me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was clear, a man standing perfectly still. His clothes were old, faded, as if they hadn't been washed in ages. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. There was something unsettling about him, something that didn't feel right. I quickly looked away, focusing on the gas pump, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. The air around me grew colder. I glanced around nervously, but the parking lot was empty. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees. My heart started to race as I finished fueling my car, and I rushed to pay, eager to leave. I walked toward the door of the convenience store, but before I could push it open, it swung open on its own. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should go in. But I needed to pay, so I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. The shelves were half stocked with old cans of food and bottles of soda. The flickering light above my head cast strange shadows across the room. I looked around but couldn't see the man from outside. Maybe he was behind one of the aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response. I hesitated, my eyes darting to the counter. A bell rang as I approached, signaling the presence of a cashier, but when I looked behind the counter, there was no one there. I was starting to feel a little uneasy. There was no one in sight, and it felt like I was being watched from every corner of the store. The silence was oppressive. I stepped closer to the counter, glancing at the register, and then I saw it. An old, yellowed photograph taped to the wall behind the counter. It was a picture of the gas station, taken years ago, and standing in front of the pumps was the man I had seen outside. He was younger in the picture, but it was unmistakably him. The same weathered face, the same strange, wide eyes. But there was something off about the picture. The date on the bottom of the photo was 1952. A shiver ran through me. This place wasn't just old, it felt trapped in time, like it hadn't changed in decades. I could feel my heart pounding now, and I knew I had to leave. I backed away slowly, but before I could turn to go, I heard a creaking sound from the back of the store. I froze. The sound came again, louder this time, like something heavy dragging across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. And then I saw him. The man. He was standing at the far end of the store, just beyond the aisles, looking at me. He hadn't moved a step, but it felt like he had been following me the entire time. His eyes locked on me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I slowly backed toward the door, trying to stay calm, my hands trembling. I could hear the man's footsteps now, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. I jumped, my heart racing as I turned to find the store completely empty. The man was gone. The shelves were untouched, the counter still unmanned. But as I looked around, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A row of photographs on the wall, each one showing the same man in different decades, standing in front of the same gas station, looking the same. Older, but never changing. I couldn't breathe. I felt trapped, like the store itself was holding me here, keeping me from leaving. And then, the lights flickered out. I don't remember what happened next. One moment I was standing there, and the next I was outside in the parking lot, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. My car was still parked at the pump, the engine running. I didn't even think twice. I jumped into my car, threw it into drive, and sped away without looking back. I never stopped at that gas station again, and I never will. I'm still not sure if what I experienced was real, or if I somehow got lost in some sort of time loop. But the pictures in that store, those eyes that never blinked, still haunt me.
Next story.
It was late, and I was driving down a desolate highway, the kind of road where you see nothing for miles except endless fields and the occasional abandoned house. My phone had died hours ago, and my car was running low on gas. I hadn't passed a gas station in what felt like forever, and I was starting to get worried. Then up ahead, I saw it, a small gas station with a flickering light, barely visible in the distance. It looked like a relic from the past, its neon sign buzzing weakly in the dark. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. At least I wouldn't have to keep driving on fumes. As I pulled into the lot, I noticed that the place seemed off. The gas station itself was old, with faded paint and rusty pumps. The parking lot was cracked, with weeds growing through the broken asphalt. But more than that, the silence was deafening. There were no cars, no sounds of the usual hum that accompanies gas stations, just complete stillness. I got out of the car, locked it, and approached the building. The door creaked open as I pushed it, revealing a dimly lit convenience store inside. The shelves were stocked, but everything looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. The bags of chips were dusty, the sodas slightly expired, and the old magazines on the counter had yellowed pages. A man stood behind the counter, but he didn't greet me. He was tall, thin, with a scruffy beard and long, unkempt hair. His eyes were distant, his expression blank. I hesitated for a moment before I spoke. Can I just get a fill-up on Pump 4? The man didn't respond at first, but then he nodded slowly, as if I had spoken to him in some language he barely understood. He shuffled toward the door, his shoes dragging on the floor. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though everything he did was a chore. I followed him outside, feeling uneasy. He went to the pump without saying a word, and I stood by my car, watching. As he inserted the nozzle into my tank, I glanced around. The place seemed abandoned, yet the lights were on. There were no cars except mine, no other customers. It was as if time had stopped here. I tried to shake the unease, telling myself I was just tired, that it had been a long drive and I was imagining things. But the longer I stood there, the more wrong it all felt. Suddenly, a low, unsettling noise broke the silence. It was coming from the back of the store, like something scraping against the walls. I looked toward the building, but the man didn't react. He just kept pumping gas, oblivious to the noise. I asked, "What's that noise?" He didn't look up. His voice, when it came, was low and hoarse. "Don't mind it. It's just the sound." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I took a step back, feeling the hairs on my neck rise. The noise continued, growing louder like nails on a chalkboard, then suddenly stopping as abruptly as it had started. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but before I could turn to get back in my car, the man spoke again. "You should go now," he said, his voice colder, more forceful this time. "It's better if you leave." I froze. There was something in his eyes now, something dark and unsettling. It was as if he wasn't talking to me anymore, but to someone, or something else. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, the temperature dropping rapidly. Before I could respond, the man moved toward the back door of the store. He didn't walk. He dragged himself, his feet scraping the floor as he moved. I took a step toward my car, but as I did, I heard a strange rustling from the darkness beyond the store, followed by what sounded like low growls. The man's voice echoed from inside the building, distorted like he was speaking through a thick fog. "Leave. Now." The words were sharp, and something about them made my blood run cold. I didn't think, didn't even hesitate. I ran back to my car, threw it in gear, and sped away without a second thought. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I could see the glow of the gas station fading into the distance. But just before I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of something that made me slam on the brakes. There, in the window of the convenience store, was a face with hollow eyes staring directly at me, its mouth twisted in an unsettling grin. It wasn't the man, it was something else. Something wrong. I didn't look back after that. I drove for miles, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the image of that face, or the eerie feeling that something had been watching me from that place. The next day, I decided to drive back, convinced that maybe I had just been too tired and imagined the whole thing. But when I reached the spot where the gas station had been, it was gone. There was nothing there, no sign, no pumps, no store, just an empty field stretching out in front of me. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who that man was or what was lurking in that gas station, but I know I'll never stop at another place like that again.
Next story.
I had been driving for hours, making my way through a part of the country I didn't recognize. The night was dark, and the road seemed endless, stretching out ahead like it would never end. I hadn't seen a car in what felt like ages, and my stomach was beginning to growl with hunger. I needed to stop for gas, but every mile I passed seemed to offer nothing but trees and more empty road. Finally, I saw it, a small old gas station in the distance, its lights flickering, barely bright enough to catch my attention. I didn't think much of it at first. I was relieved just to see something. It looked like it hadn't been updated in years, with its faded sign and peeling paint. The gas pumps were old, the kind you see in old movies, and the convenience store attached to it seemed like it was stuck in the 80s. I pulled in, the tires crunching on the gravel as I parked. The place looked abandoned, and I thought for a moment it might be closed. But the light above the door was on, and I could see movement inside. I stepped out of the car and stretched, feeling the cool night air on my skin. As I approached the pump, I noticed something strange, the silence. Not the peaceful, calm kind of silence, but the kind that felt off. It was almost too still, like the whole world had stopped for a moment. The old man behind the counter was looking out the window, his face gaunt and pale. He didn't seem to notice me at first, and I felt a strange hesitation as I walked up to the door. The bell above the door chimed when I entered. The man didn't greet me or look up. He just kept staring outside, his eyes unfocused, like he was waiting for something or someone. I couldn't tell if it was just the dim light or the man's condition, but something about him gave me a chill. I approached the counter, feeling uncomfortable under his gaze. "Hey," I said, trying to break the silence. "I need to fill up." The man's head turned slowly, his eyes scanning me in a way that felt unnerving, like he could see right through me. $2, he said in a raspy voice, his lips barely moving. I handed him the cash, but as I did, I noticed something strange. The register was covered in dust, like it hadn't been used in years. The whole store felt frozen in time. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I felt a strange sense of urgency to leave. I turned back toward the door, but then I saw something that made my stomach twist. There, standing at the window of the store, was a figure. A woman, just standing there, staring out into the night. I couldn't see her face clearly, but there was something about the way she stood, still, lifeless, as though she were waiting for something. Waiting for me. I froze, my heart beating faster. I glanced back at the man behind the counter, but he was still staring at the window, his hands resting motionless on the counter. He hadn't reacted to the woman. It was like she wasn't even there to him. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Something in my gut told me I shouldn't go outside, that something was wrong. But I couldn't turn back. I had to know. I walked slowly toward the door, my feet heavy on the floor. As I got closer to the window, I felt a growing sense of dread. When I reached the door and looked out, I saw her face clearly. She was pale, her hair disheveled, her clothes old and torn. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on something far in the distance, as if she wasn't even aware I was standing there. And then she blinked. Slowly, deliberately. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The woman wasn't real. She couldn't be. I was just imagining it. My mind must have been playing tricks on me. I turned to leave, but the man behind the counter spoke in a low, hoarse voice. "She's been waiting a long time," he said. I didn't want to know what he meant. I couldn't bring myself to ask. I quickly grabbed my things and rushed back to the car, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get out of there. As I started the car and pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gas station fading into the distance. But that's not what I saw. The woman was standing outside, her face pressed against the glass of the door, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my heart still pounding in my chest. I pulled into a small motel, not even caring about the price. I just needed to get out of the car to feel safe. But even as I lay in bed trying to calm my nerves, I couldn't shake the image of her face, how empty and lifeless it was. The way she waited. The next morning, I drove back down the same road, determined to forget the whole thing. But when I reached the spot where the gas station had been, I stopped. There was nothing there. No sign. No pumps. No store. Just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was all in my head. But I'll never forget the way the woman looked at me, the way she waited. And I'm never stopping at a gas station like that again.
Next story.
It had been a long day of driving. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the road in front of me stretched on for what felt like an eternity. My eyes were tired, my body was stiff, and my stomach had been growling for the last few hours. I hadn't seen a town or another car for miles. When I finally spotted a gas station in the distance, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't much, just a small, rundown place with a few pumps and a convenience store that looked like it had seen better days. But it would have to do. I pulled in, parked by the pump, and got out of the car. The place was quiet, too quiet, and the only sound was the distant chirp of crickets. I grabbed my wallet from the car and started walking toward the convenience store. The lights inside flickered sporadically, giving the place an eerie, unsettling feeling. But I was too tired to think much of it. A quick stop to fuel up, grab a snack, and I could get back on the road. When I walked inside, the air was heavy, and the dim lights cast long shadows on the shelves. The shelves themselves were sparse, with only a few old bags of chips, soda cans, and stale-looking snacks. The cashier was standing behind the counter, an older man with a scruffy beard and a worn-out baseball cap. He didn't look up when I entered, just stared ahead, his hands resting on the counter. I approached the counter and said, "Hey, Kay, can I get a pack of gum and a bottle of water?" The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his eyes dull, unfocused. I was starting to feel uncomfortable under his gaze. You're not from around here, are you? He finally said, his voice raspy. No, I answered quickly, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I'm just passing through. The man gave a slow nod, then slid the items toward me without saying anything else. I paid for them, still feeling the tension in the air. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The door to the back room was cracked open, and through the small gap, I could see a faint, flickering light coming from inside. But that wasn't the odd part. What caught my attention was the soft sound, almost like muffled voices drifting from behind the door. I froze. The voices sounded strange, like they were speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Low and distorted, as though they were being altered by static. It was hard to tell exactly what they were saying, but the tone was eerie, unnatural. I stood there for a moment, wondering whether I should investigate or just leave. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I felt a growing sense of dread. Before I could make up my mind, the cashier spoke again, his voice low and almost menacing. You should go. His words sent a jolt of fear through me. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get in my car and never look back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I glanced back at the door to the back room. The voices were growing louder now, more distinct, and I could swear I heard someone crying. Go now, the man repeated, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed the water and gum, ran back to my car, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I reversed out of the parking lot and sped down the road. I didn't stop for the rest of the night. My heart was pounding in my chest and my mind raced with questions. Who was in the back room? Why was the man acting so strange? What were those voices? I didn't get answers, and I didn't expect to. But I couldn't forget the feeling of that place, the isolation, the strange unease that settled over me the moment I stepped inside. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized how wrong it all felt. The next morning, I had a few hours of daylight left and decided to retrace my route. I was determined to figure out what had happened. When I reached the gas station again, my stomach dropped. The place was gone. There was nothing but an empty patch of land where it had stood the night before. I pulled over and got out of the car. My mind was spinning. I looked around, but there was no sign of the pumps, no convenience store, nothing. Just a barren lot and a few scattered pieces of old, rusted metal. I walked around the lot, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing, no trace of the gas station. It was as if it had never been there at all. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if the gas station was real or if I imagined it. But the more I think about it, the more I wonder if I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I never stopped at another gas station that felt like that. Not even once.